Good morning and welcome back. I'm going to start a discussion today, kind of to build on what I was talking about yesterday with how almost starting something new is a little bit of a transition where there's this kind of uncertain period and we don't really know what to expect. So sometimes we almost pull back from what our full capacity might be, and then almost kind of examine, what is the feedback that I'm getting? How do I feel about the feedback? And then what can I reevaluate? And then how can I move forward again? So this is very, very healthy, because oftentimes if we're doing something the exact same way all the time, we don't realize that we're actually undermining our own potential and our own ability for growth. And the way I want to almost parallel this is with children who are in kindergarten. Usually if they haven't been in a daycare setting before, they're not really accustomed to what is a transition. So a transition, as we know, is, for example, if we're all playing, in the playroom, and then all of a sudden it's time to have lunch. So the children will know, okay, it's now time to clean up, so that means you have to stop what you're doing. Usually, actually, the early childhood educator will say, we have 10 more minutes, so then that means, I'm going to maybe put something that's concrete to show, when this hand, which is right here, maybe on the 10, it moves all the way up to 12, that's 10 minutes. So when that time is finished, we're going to clean up and we're going to have lunch. Sometimes they'll do this in a picture format, depending if they know that there's a child maybe with autism who maybe has an understanding that needs to be kind of supported with some kind of picture. If they know that, then that is available for everybody actually as a support, but especially for children with autism who need that kind of support. So anyway, she'll do that or he'll do that, and then the children will kind of, if they're new to this language or they don't really know, like, what are we expecting in this setting, they'll finally figure out that, okay, when we see everybody tidying up and the staff or whoever is in the classroom is also starting to clean up, to kind of model, this is what we have to do. Then they'll put everything away and then kind of, okay, now we have to go to the washroom, we have to wash our hands, maybe we have to put a smock on, depending on what we're having for lunch. If it's soup, it's probably messy, so therefore, this is a good idea. Now we sit down and then we're waiting. Now some people will, while the staff are kind of preparing the meal, checking what's like a dietary restriction, or how do we need to be careful about how maybe we seat everybody. And then they'll usually engage the children in a song, almost like some kind of blessing, like, oh, we're hungry, we're waiting, we're grateful. All these ideas to almost prepare the mind, and like this kind of social idea of when we're sitting together and we're eating, this is why. It's because maybe we need something warm for our tummy. And all this, when we do it in a song format, it just reinforces for the children that this is a safe transition, like what we did here. You know what to expect, what's coming next, and you know why, because now you can kind of put these emotions together and say, well, I was feeling irritable and I didn't know why. Now that I know that I'm getting hungry, I remember that, oh, when I do have that feeling of fullness, I usually feel better, and then after that I feel tired. So maybe they'll see staff putting beds out or cots out, so then they realize, oh, after this I'll go to sleep. So knowing what to expect next is very, very calming, and it's reassuring in that we're not like stuck in some kind of anxious middle frozen state where, like, what happens next? Should I know what happens next? Like, what if I don't? And I'm like looking for cues around me, nobody knows what's going on, and then it becomes where kids get anxious and they start crying and they have behaviors, and then everybody gets frazzled, right? So almost having this seamless way of going from one activity to the other, because somebody else has done it, is very reassuring. So being a pioneer in something is always very, very stressful, because you don't know like an established way yet. You're actually building it as you go. And so that's why I almost want to support the idea that knowing that there is an omnipotent power in the universe that is allowing this to happen is all the assurance that you need. Because you think, if I align with something that is powerful and is known to be very powerful, because I've seen examples of it in the past and read about it, as well as experienced it in my life in some form or another, I really don't have anything to worry about aside from what a status quo is in a society. So I might just be worried that people will not support me, and I'll have to figure out a socially acceptable way of almost persevering in spite of that, knowing that because I'm aligning with the universe, I'm trying something new. I'm not trying to be unethical. It might look unethical depending on who you're asking, but it's something progressive. It's maybe some other communities have already tried, and I'm trying to maybe incorporate or allow in my own personal understanding within a community that may have some kind of restriction or may not quite be as progressive, or maybe still too conservative. So knowing this now about how we sort of allow ourselves to segue into like a new idea or a new way of existing or a new lifestyle, almost knows, okay, well, this is maybe what we should expect, like as a process or as a method, as a kind of like a structure that we should think about in our mind. So for me, it was, I went to Carleton. If you read my blog, themythoftruth.com, you'll kind of see an outline of this, but it's basically, I went to school thinking I had an idea of what religion was. I came to contact with Islam from a third party objective kind of viewer. So he talked about Islam from like a Sufism perspective, which is mostly not really focusing on the ritual aspect or the rites, more focusing on the spiritual elements of it. And from there, it almost sidestepped like all the differences that exist within the construct of people who label themselves as Muslims, and all the differences of opinion around how to do something that's like a practice or a ritual. So by just keeping that almost surface, almost preview of what Islam can be as a construct, as it were, not quite a religion, it's just a way of existing in the world, it helped me almost revisit what do I understand of my life and what religion is and how I want to embody my understanding now relative to other world religions. So with that in mind, I started to wonder about, well, I don't really know much about the secular world. Like, I've always kind of grouped things in my mind differently. So I'd say this is what the secular world does. My family growing up wasn't really comfortable with me engaging in this yet because they didn't really know what are the ramifications of it. It might have been supported in scripture just because, well, back then it was in a primitive society, pre-civilization. And then in my traditional family, it was almost like, dating, we don't really do. It's almost like this kind of structured format of trying to get to know a family, seeing if we're a family that can somehow get along. We have common goals, common understandings of God. Excuse me. And then with regards to alcohol, it's not something we engage in because we know that it almost limits your clarity of mind. And when we're praying and we're thinking about how to be in the world, we're trying to be as alert as possible. Cannabis wasn't legal yet. Smoking was something that people engaged in or didn't, but the premise for wanting to exist for life and kind of promote a healthy way of living was almost don't do anything that's going to detract from your understanding of how to live a healthy life. So it was don't sabotage your own well-being in any way. So all these things were in place, and I was like, all right, that's like, I understand nothing's really changed. I'm trying to understand now a little bit about how to incorporate a spiritual understanding within almost the structured framework of living, of existing. So this is where I was able to incorporate, like, okay, God is known as, in a lot of different world views, an ineffable being, which means it's very difficult to find the words to understand how to explain God. So people will just say, he's not this and he's not that, which means you can say he is like something, but that's building an analogy that's already limiting. So it's defining something that's undefinable. So then you can say, well, if it's not like this, it's not like that. So think of a tree. You can say a tree is not like a flower, but it's also not like a vegetable. So then you think, okay, so it's living. It's something that maybe provides some kind of life or some kind of aesthetic to life, but now I need to know more about it. So then you'll have more description. So you can say, well, it can be really, really, really big. It takes years to grow. It can provide a lot of shade. If you're under on a hot day, it'll actually create a nice breeze. So now you're starting to think, yeah, that's not like a vegetable. And then you think, well, where does a vegetable come from? And it might be like a little shrub in the ground. So then you think, okay, like I'm thinking pepper. So like that doesn't provide shade. That even if it takes years to grow, it's still kind of small and close to the ground. You think of a flower, you're like, it doesn't provide any shade, like maybe for an insect. So now you're starting to grow like your imagination. You're starting to think really, really big. And then you can think, some people, depending on the size of their window, if they look out, all they could see is this tree. So then you think, wow, this must be really big. And then some people will say, and if you are in a park and you're really close to a tree and you try to take a picture, you won't be able to see the full tree. You have to like go really, really, really far back, be able to see the tree from a distance, and then take a picture. And then maybe have somebody standing next to that tree so that you can see the relative size, right? So sometimes people do this with a cactus. In a cactus imagination, we think, oh, it's probably not like that big, like it might, come up next to a person. But when I was in high school, I had I think it was a chemistry teacher who was, I guess he went to a desert and he took a picture of himself standing next to a cactus, and it was like probably 3 or 4 times his size, like really, really big. So it gives you a relative understanding of something. So this is what we understand when we talk about God as ineffable. So when this professor at Carleton was explaining this to me, my first instinct was, but I don't know how to accept that, because in the Quran, all it is descriptions of God. So I took a step back and was like, wait a minute, but if I didn't have that description, how would I think about the universe? I was like, yeah, that's true. I wouldn't really know. Like, I'd be thinking, like, I can have like a picture, like these satellite pictures of the universe or the galaxy, and I could think, yeah, like I'm a living spirit. Like, there's a spirit inside me that keeps me alive, that keeps everything alive. But is that it? Like, is that God? So then you think, yeah, I mean, I guess now that we have these understandings of, you know, an archangel visited the world with ideas of how to inspire a human to think about this ineffable being, is almost like, oh, that's a gift, because now I can help my understanding almost approximate something about the world that otherwise would not be accessible to me. So all of these things are like tentative trials to grapple with how we can understand and how we can interact with the world. So I want to now think about how this can be supported. If you look at scripture and we think, okay, well, I'm starting to believe in the validity of this inspired person called Muhammad, and this angel who used to visit him and continues to visit throughout time. Maybe in the last third of the night, maybe depending on, you know, any person's kind of struggle during the day, and they're like praying for inspiration, and then all of a sudden like an idea comes to mind, and like, oh, it's probably like the angel, you know, coming to inspire me, and then leaves. So all this is positive optimism. It's very, very healthy outlook. So you think, okay, what if I'm trying to almost, you know, take my time, and I see somebody who's maybe delving into something way too quickly, maybe looks like they're taking a shortcut. So my instinct could be, I should probably stop that person, or maybe I should stop to observe. I'm going to give you this verse, and it says, verily, like, surely, whenever God starts a verse or any kind of, it's almost like before talking about something, it's almost like he wants to emphasize or reinforce the importance of it. Like, if God swears by something, it's almost like, because it's so valuable, like, pay attention almost. So God says, verily, the person who tries to grow or be charitable with himself or their understanding of the universe will have a healthy harvest, right? So it's almost like if you think of somebody who's going to plant something or has livestock, I mentioned before with Adam and Cain and Abel, you think, yeah, like, there's no time frame that we can know, because we don't know what they're harvesting. It could be an idea, it could be actual crop, it could be livestock, it could be, you know, a project, a science project, a technology. Anything that they're putting effort in is going to have a reward, or like a return on investment, which we call a harvest. So you can say that the person who is charitable with themselves and the universe is going to have a healthy harvest, regardless, because they're being effortful and intentional in a healthy way, in an ethical way in the universe. And then God follows that verse by saying, and almost bereft is the person who represses themselves. So then you think, wait, I do want to have that kindness in my heart. Like, I don't, like, you almost like, oh wait, I don't want to stop, and I want to continue, like, what is it that I want to do? And then you start thinking, like, okay, what are my interests? And you almost want to jump in right away. Instead, it's sometimes like a healthy idea to just continue with something that you might have been hesitant to try. So if I was seeing somebody that I wanted to almost pull back and say, you're not allowed to do that, instead I would say, wait, maybe, why did I think that? And then, well, I'm going to watch and see what happens with them, and then maybe I'll know, maybe I want to try that, right? And that's what we want to encourage. That's what breaks that zeitgeist, which is basically, my grandparents were used to one thing, my parents were used to another thing, and maybe because they traveled to a new different country, they want to almost keep what their parents allowed them to practice for their own kids, right? So we grow up almost like, okay, we'll do what our parents did and what our grandparents did. But as we're growing, we're becoming more comfortable in our surroundings. Maybe if we have kids, we almost abandon some of what our grandparents did, what our parents did, and we're trying to allow them, like our kids, to maybe acculturate in a certain way that's more accommodating to what the society is, because we already see that it's very safe. It's a really normal practice. It's just maybe not practiced back home because there was a different time. It's a completely different culture, and we don't even know if, you know, back home it's now a common practice as well. So why don't we just allow this to continue as well? So knowing that almost allows us to know that when children come with new ideas that maybe is new to us, we should actually encourage it, because that keeps them contemporary. If we think of Muhammad's time, and he had, when he was 40, Ali, his cousin, was 10, you think that's kind of giving us that 30-year gap that allows for, I'm going to go with whatever the youngest can almost abstractly think about and comprehend and grasp, and then accommodate my ideas with that growing up. So it's almost like I'm trying to take from my experience of life and use it to support whatever their new ideas are, so that I can almost help them almost have the confidence to continue and say, like, just because this is new doesn't mean I can't do it, right? It's like, no, you can, and I'm learning with you. And then your life experience will say, well, maybe if I'm holding back, I'll let them give it a try, because maybe their mind's still very flexible and more able to absorb new ideas and creative thinking, rather than maybe our inherited kind of closed-mindedness, because we're not used to thinking quite as laterally, and maybe the world isn't quite as open for us as it is for like a 10-year-old. So a person who is rewarded for being someone who's proactive and engaging with the universe, versus somebody who's almost stunted in a way for repressing their natural instinct, is a way to emphasize that, I mean, what is our purpose on earth then? It's not really to keep traditions like stuck in a world view that's like in the past, but it's almost to say, well, what can I understand from the past that I can almost think about as, yeah, it's kind of like a shock to what that society would have understood this miracle to be, but it's probably in the future going to be something that's very normal. So I talked about the miracle of Jesus being a boy who's just born from a single parent. Now we know that's a very normal thing. I talked about the camel of Saul, who, different from the time of Paul and Saul, and that almost conversion of state of mind that he went through when he was going from, I think, I don't remember where in the Middle East he was traveling, but it was almost like he went from somebody who didn't know how to believe in the universe and Christ to somebody who did. So it was almost like he had this enlightening moment. Saul before that was a person who the Quran describes was from a community called Thamud, and that story basically engages the idea of life and death and rebirth, and how the miracle of, like, we don't really know how to understand what animals are, right? So if we think of ourselves as being made from the earth, the camel came from the mountain almost to signify, I mean, we are mammals and we do have to care for other life in the world, and we know now that because it came from the mountain, as it were, it's something that reinforces something of what we can know about, like, what the future might say about, you know, cloning and, you know, almost harvesting part of an animal from something else, because it's all part of the earth, right? So how do we do this ethically? So this is almost like how we think of AI right now, and humans and robots, and how do we kind of maybe create a prosthetic arm before we decide, can we take over a person's mind because we can read the scans, and then to what degree should we do that, because is that ethical if we take away someone's, you know, freedom of expression and thought and autonomy? So all these are new questions, and it's good to grapple with them, because we have to know that we have to do it safely if we do try, and there should be like a collection of people who are trying not to be biased in favor of it, in case the actual human being decides, I want to unplug from this machine so I can, you know, regain my autonomy in the world without having to rely on this machine, then they should be allowed to, right? So so basically that story of the camel is almost to signify, yeah, in the future there's probably going to be something that looks miraculous like that, where we're going to be allowed to do it, but then we have to wonder about the ethic of it. And then if we do want to cancel it, you know, in what way are we going to? Because if we're not giving it its free right, as it were, then we are going to be in some way having to deal with the consequence. So if we think, okay, we have this machine attached to a person, and maybe it looks like whatever his brain scan is, it allows us to think with this person about something that's brand new. So I gave the example of an 80-year-old who has such in-depth knowledge and maybe understanding of the universe that we want to keep that in the world, because it helps us think ethically about how to arrive at a conclusion. So we think, okay, we're going to keep this person, and then we'll say maybe 2 days of the week, right? And then 3 days we'll give this person a break. He hasn't died yet. And then, you know, as we're going on, like the scientists for the 5 days that they're not attaching this machine to this person, I'm like, man, we're really patient. We can't wait for like these 5 days to be over so we can, you know, get new ideas. And they almost want to take shortcuts and be like, hey, what if we don't tell him? We just do it anyway, right? Now that's not ethical. That's being sneaky, for one thing. The second thing is, now we're taking away from that person's right, because he already signed and agreed that I'm only going to do this for 2 days, and I'm going to be aware that you're doing it so I can try to focus my ideas. I understand that my privacy is being preserved. You're not going to just know everything about my private life anymore. So all of these things we have to think about, and this is usually what an ethic board will do, is that they'll say, before we engage in this experiment, all of this has to be described and explained, and if people don't almost uphold what these rules are, there will be some kind of consequence. So maybe they'll have to pay a fine, maybe they'll have to cancel the experiment, maybe they won't be allowed to practice as scientists anymore. All of these things almost say, like, this is how serious it is with the human life. You can't just ruin somebody's life and say, well, it was just a science experiment and they said we could, right? It's almost like we're doing this together and it's brand new. We haven't done this before, so we have to be extra careful, because people who come after us have to know what we did that didn't work, and what we did that is working, so that they know, well, we can't do this anymore because we know for sure it's not going to work. So it's almost like we have a new and healthier way of continuing on with a new idea. So all of this is a scientific method, and this is why people love science. When you understand how to integrate the universe with a scientific lens, you love to explore anything. What we are, I think, new at doing right now is combining the arts and humanities and religion and philosophy and all these different ways of existing with science, and trying to understand, well, we can't really measure God, so how do we combine the two? Because philosophy is often thinking about the universe in a way of humans are thinking and they're guessing almost without thinking about God and being involved. That's philosophy. Religion is we are trying to be in the world assuming that we understand that God is with us and He's going to help us. We can't really measure that because each individual person has a story that emphasizes and reinforces that, yeah, God is helping me. So now you have philosophy, you have religion, and then you have science. And not all scientists believe in God in a way that maybe philosophers do or don't, or the people that in religion do or don't. So that's why they just call themselves scientists, and they don't really want to talk about God in a way because they can't really measure. Like, how do I measure my own faith and then compare it with another scientist that I'm working with? You can't. It's just a kind of belief that gives you faith in wanting to continue in an ethical way, and knowing that, you know, if the universe speaks to me in a certain way, it's because, you know, I have to maybe revisit a new idea or review why I'm doing something. It's going to be completely different from the next person next to me because he doesn't live his life exactly the same as I do. And even if he did, his ideas, because his subconscious is very different than mine, even if they were identical twins, it's still going to be a little bit different. So knowing all this now, when you combine these three almost fields of study, you can understand why we want to build that sort of multidisciplinary approach to learning. So when I was in university, I think it was when I was in my first year, somebody had talked about an interdisciplinary approach to studying, which is a self-directed learning. It's almost like you can go into university with it's almost like an undeclared major. So it's almost to say, I just want to go in as though I'm a general student. I think it used to be a 3-year program instead of 4. It might change. And you could go into a college this way as well. It's almost to say, I just want to know that my grades are good enough, my understanding of how to study is good enough that I could choose different programs to study. And because I want all these different programs, I want to understand all the different courses that I'd have to kind of think about wanting to read about and study with one professor who likes this kind of learning. And that way I'm almost on my own, I'm at home and I'm studying on my own. But I have this advisor, so I have this professor who is almost like someone I can check in with and say, so this is, maybe I'm studying physics, and I say, you know, I'm having a really difficult time with this. So he'll say, oh, I can connect you with this professor. And this professor these two will talk and say, you know, I have this student who's working on this project. Do you mind answering his questions? So he'll say, yeah, I have office hours in this time in this location. So you'll go and visit with that physics professor, have your question answered, and then you come back and you finish. You know, another time you'll say, there's this philosopher that I have no idea how to understand what his ways of thinking were. So you'll talk to an advisor, he'll connect maybe with a completely new university and say, I know this university specializes or has like a lot of faculty who engage with this philosopher, right? So then he'll text them and he'll say, you can't really visit in person, but maybe you can connect with them, you know, via Zoom or like one of these cool new video conference calls. So you can, you know, log on, you can talk face to face, and then you can, you know, have your discussion, have your questions answered, and then you can continue with your project. So in this way, it's almost like homeschooling, but now you're doing it with people who are experts in their field of study because they've been doing this for a very long time, that they can support your learning. So this is kind of what I want to wonder about as we kind of, we want to ensure that the understanding of a university learning experience, or a college learning experience, or high school or school, is very, very important, because it gives us this broad idea of how to learn, all the different things we can learn, and it keeps us up to date and contemporary with, you know, what's kind of normal for people to think about and know, and then where can they decide where they want to specialize. What maybe we are trying to step away from is a preset way of thinking about how to learn. So before, when I used to go to school, it used to be, you're going to go into a science program, and it already has all these courses, and you have to take all of them, and you only have a choice of maybe 8 courses in 4 years that you can choose. Everything else, these are the exact courses you have to take. If you don't take them, you can't pass, you don't get your degree, right? So you can keep that if somebody already knows for sure, I know that I want to become a doctor. So then they know, well, these are definitely the courses that have to be taken, because I have to understand everything about the body. And then science and ethics and, you know, people and how to deal with people, so psychology, all these kind of courses. Somebody who's thinking, I want to build something completely new. Like, I have all these skills, all these interests, I want to build something new. So then universities can say, well, if this is the interest, it's kind of like politics. They'll say, well, if this is what people are asking about and they're writing about it, when they write, you know, I want to apply to this university, and they're writing an essay to explain something about themselves, then the university can read it, because they usually get together as a board, and like you see Legally Blonde, it'll kind of help you understand what I'm trying to explain here. And basically what happens is they'll review like these essays as a group and say, well, this person looks like he would be a good person to come to our school because, and then they'll give a reason, and they'll say, okay, you're accepted and you can come and study here. And then before you know it, you have this completely new way of thinking, and like a lot of people are probably thinking about the same way, and if they haven't, if you tell them, they'll be like, oh my gosh, I want to do that, right? So now you have almost new ways of thinking that are coming to life and keeping things current, and allowing for new ideas to be integrated into the world as well. So corporations or businesses will have students graduating with this and be like, oh my gosh, we never would have thought this could have happened. And then they, you know, they want to tell other people and build new partnerships, and then the world progresses and civilization continues to grow. So when we think about this as an idea of, well, you know, back then, how did Muhammad and his friends learn? And that's exactly it. They went about their regular day. So some people were good at commerce, some people were good at agriculture, some people were good at building, like blacksmiths, so building weapons like swords and shields and armor. A lot of people love to travel and just understand how to live in other cultures and how to study. And if you think about it, all Muhammad did was, he was just like an extra person, basically. You can think of as like an advisor who was inspired and used to tell people, you know, what you're doing is good for your family, but you know, maybe the girls in your family don't have a right to think for themselves. Why don't you think this way, and support them and let them try on their own, right? Maybe they're not allowed to travel alone yet because it wasn't very safe. It's just open desert, and it could be like wild animals or anything that on the path that could hurt them. So then you think, well, maybe we'll travel together as a caravan. Women maybe weren't given very much rights yet, so it was, you know, instead of holding a woman captive or like a prisoner and then like maybe using her as a slave, some people used to marry them, almost to say like you're progressing up in the world, as it were, like so you have more rights now because you're almost protected by this person who isn't going to misuse you or like, you know, treat you very badly. So all these ways are just, because it's a very primitive society, it's almost like a way of thinking like, oh, these women are not like animals that I can just, you know, use like a horse or something and just make it do work for me, and then that's the end. It's giving them like, you have to think differently about people now. People are not the same as animals, although we have to care for all kinds of life. It's a way of thinking, you know, women might look like they're weaker because they think a lot with their heart before their brain, but they're actually very strong because they can carry a baby and they know how to understand emotions and think about life in a way that's supposed to help men understand that part of themselves too, because sometimes they worry about the final goal, and they have to remember, I have to make sure what I'm doing is ethical too, like it's not hurting my own emotions, making me feel guilty, or other people's emotions on the way. So I want to almost help us understand this worldview, because sometimes people who come from a religious tradition love understanding the universe and how to incorporate these ethical ways, but they don't find a way to apply it in a public university setting. So they almost have this learned helplessness. It's almost like I have to keep my understanding of the universe boxed, and then when I go into work, I almost might feel limited in how I can apply what I want to, and in writing, right? So if you say, you know, it's very ethical to harvest organs, for example, but maybe before we do it to humans, we do it in animals. And then you find, oh, we already do that, so that's great. Other people might say, we don't really know if we should do that because we believe in life and death. So if we do that to a person who's dead, is that actually going to hurt them in their grave before they wake up again? And you might say, yeah, that's true. Like, they're being charitable with their body after they pass away, but we don't really know what to do. So then people will say, maybe we can have synthetic organs. Like, you know about cars right now. They have different oils that you can buy to help the car run smoothly. Sometimes they won't make it with oil, like crude oil. I think they make a synthetic one, so it's not quite the same thing. And then now that you have electric cars, maybe like it completely changes how a car runs. So all these ways of evolving, because we integrate new worldviews and world ethics and understandings about the ramifications or the consequences of an action on life and death, we begin to allow ourselves to try new things without feeling like everything's always no, 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 because the religion, 1400 years ago said no. I mean, it could have, because back then it was very primitive and the people didn't really have the equipment or the technology to support, a way of being yet, or even thinking about it yet. So why not try and then see how things happen after that. So this is kind of like a way of building new expertise, because sometimes you'll find a person who is very divinely oriented or really wants to understand the universe and build the ethic. They somehow have this divine facilitation, like the world just facilitates itself for them, like Taoism. It just becomes such an easy way to exist that people almost want to work with that person, but then they find, oh, but they didn't go to school, so they don't have any formal understanding of how to be an engineer, for example, or how to build bridges, or the codes that we have to kind of abide by so that the bridge doesn't collapse after like 2 cars drive on it. So it's almost like, how do we encourage this person to want to integrate those two so that we can all learn together? I think that's kind of like a new beginning for us as we kind of evolve into and out of artificial intelligence to kind of like a technological intelligence of, if we think of like scripture and tradition and inspiration as a technology of itself that's natural, then we won't think of it as something that's always a rule that says yes or no. It'll be more of, let's try to understand and communicate an idea together and see what we'll end up coming up with.